Hello and welcome. You're listening to the COVID Inquiry podcast. In this section, Elkan and Lorelei sit down with Thomas Jones and Barbara Herbert. They're discussing how they feel about the Welsh issues that have been covered in this week's Module 1 evidential hearings. Please note, some listeners may find the contents of this podcast distressing.
So we have with us two new guests, Thomas Jones, who is one of our barristers team and who is dealing with the Welsh issues.
And we have Barbara Herbert, who's from COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK, the Welsh branch. Welcome you both.
Thank you very much for having me.
I have kind of a general question. There have been a lot of calls for a COVID inquiry specific to Wales, and I know campaigners and opposition politicians are saying it's the only way decisions taken in Wales can be properly scrutinised. Why is there not a special one?
One of the things is Mark Drakeford has resisted it because of the costs to the Welsh government to actually have its own specific inquiry. And he has always said from day one that he's prepared to have a Welsh inquiry in the event that things aren't scrutinised properly. So he's, in doing that, that's admitting that there might be things missed. But a Senate committee has been set up and will start its proceedings next week. It's cross-party and it will be talking about, they'll be dealing with what they think has been missed in Module 1.
And what do you think of, so I know it's early days and this is only Module 1, but we are at the end of week 5. How do you think it is going? Do you think it is answering the question?
Well, my view is that there still remains a number of questions. Of course, the Welsh witnesses predominantly were dealt with over the course of 2 days last week on the 3rd of July and the 4th of July. A number of issues are beginning to emerge, in particular issues such as capacity and budget, complexity of structures, the relationship between the UK government and the UK government, and the possibly the extent to which certain plans were not sufficiently updated. A number of those issues have been identified over the course of really those 2 days of evidence, but certainly a number of questions still remain.
Well, can you tell us about the witnesses we've had? I think the first one was Sir Frank Atherton, who's the current CMO for Wales.
That's right. So the Welsh witnesses, if you like, or the principal Welsh witnesses, started off with Sir Frank Atherton, who is, as you say, the chief medical officer. So in that role, he is the central advisor to the Welsh Government in relation to public health matters and is the medical director to the Welsh NHS. He therefore has effectively 3 domains to provide advice to the Welsh ministers. He's the medical director of the NHS, and also, as he described, he's an advocate on behalf of the health and population. In his evidence, he accepted really that going into the pandemic, he didn't have the sufficient resource that he would require. He didn't have a CMO directorate, and Lady Hallis herself asked a number of questions about the extent of his resource. He was asked about the UK risk register and the extent of his involvement in that in the UK risk register. He accepted that he doesn't recall ever having any personal input into the national risk register. And there was some questions exploring the fact that there is, of course, a Scottish risk assessment and a UK risk assessment, but not a Welsh specific risk assessments. So he had a number of questions there about his involvement in that UK risk register. He was asked a number of questions about Vaughan Gethin's statement, which accepted that preparedness was not a particular focus of interest or concern in the government. And to some extent, Frank Atherton was able to say that really, at an official level, things were working quite well on the ground, even if Vaughan Gethin made those statements in his written evidence.
Did he throw ministers under the bus at one point by saying ministers did not? He offered his advice freely, but they did not always follow it diligently.
I think he was to some extent, yes. Although he did also try and save things by saying that actually ministers, in his experience, were quite receptive to advice that he gave. There are effectively two important documents in terms of a Welsh perspective. There is the Major Infectious Disease Emergencies Framework and the corresponding guidance. And he was asked a round of questions about the extent to which those two important documents for Wales are really aligned to the 2011 strategy, or whether there was anything sort of Welsh specific about them. He didn't really accept that the broad approach of the framework and the corresponding guidance was from the 2011 strategy, because, in his words, we already had the 2011 pandemic flu plan. But he says that they formed the basis from that 2011 UK document. So there's these two important documents for Wales. There's the framework and the guidance document. There is an acceptance on his part that he doesn't recall those documents being updated. He says, "I don't believe there has been a process to update them." He accepted that the overarching guidance documents for pandemic influenza and HCIDs were based on the 2011 flu strategy, and agreed that they were based on 2011 thinking. There were some questions put to him in respect of institutional learning and his involvement in Cygnus from 2014 and Cygnus from 2016. He, of course, wasn't in post at the time of the 2014 exercise, but was in post at the time of the 2016 exercise. He indicated in his evidence that he doesn't recall that the LRF structures were tested, and that was arguably because they were dealt with in the 2014 exercise. But he also accepts that those two important documents which we've spoken about, he doesn't recall the testing of those two important documents in the exercise. I think in his evidence he describes them as background documents.
He also, Christian Helen, asked if he had seen a recommendation from NerveTech for face masks to be available in hospitals and ambulance social care staff, and he said he didn't recall seeing that documentation. My impression of him was that he did everything sounded very chaotic. He said he was drowning in a sea of misinformation, and that he couldn't even manage his emails. And he said that they were very under-resourced.
Yeah, resource continues to be an issue, I think, and that's an issue that we really see, particularly in Goodall's evidence, and indeed in Mark Drakeford's evidence, which we'll come on to in a moment. I'd just like to finish on one point that Frank Atherton made towards the end of his evidence, and that was in respect to the Health Protection Advisory Committee that he sought to re-establish in May of 2018. And this was really established as he considered there to be a gap in Wales, as there was only high consequence infection units in London and in Newcastle. You'll probably remember this was an important part of his evidence. And he felt at the time that we ought to have some provision in Wales and a process to embark upon for dealing with that provision. It was effectively put that until he established this particular committee to look at this particular issue of there only being these units in Newcastle and London, this wasn't an issue which was looked at in sufficient detail before. An important issue, because of course if you become infected in Wales with a high consequence infectious disease, your management, your treatment and the public health consequences would all be transferred across the border. He maintained that these arrangements which were in place were adequate, but these were efforts to strengthen the system. He didn't accept that they were inadequate, although he was taken to an email from December of 2019, where he noted in response to earlier infections that at a planning meeting that he'd attended to confirm how we would respond to one or both residents becoming unwell, it became clear that we were not adequately prepared for such, and he described that difference as inelegant. That same day we heard from Andrew Goodall, who is, of course, the Welsh Government Permanent Secretary. He took up that role in November of 2021, and he effectively leads the Welsh Government Civil Service.
And his testimony extended over 2 days. I think it was.
That's right.
Quite well, yeah.
That's right. He was due to give evidence originally on the Monday morning, but then his evidence was pushed back to the Monday afternoon, and then that ran into the Tuesday morning. So when we say we had 2 days to deal with the Welsh witnesses, what we really mean is we had a day and a half. And again, there were a number of issues arising, bringing up some of the same themes from Andrew Goodall's evidence. Andrew Goodall, in his written evidence, gave a very, very detailed and comprehensive rundown of Welsh devolution and how it fed into civil contingencies, which was extremely helpful. And given his background, that experience was really used as an opportunity to explore some of that history.
Can I ask? I had a question. I made a note. He used the expression "task and finish."
Yes.
What is that?
So, following swine flu, the Wales Resilience Partnership team agreed that a Wales Pandemic Flu Task and Finish group should be established. Following exercise sickness, the Wales Resilience Partnership team delegated responsibility to the Wales Pandemic Flu Preparedness Group, and the Readiness Board was promulgated, and that was really there to ensure that recommendations arising from sickness were identified and finished. And it was accepted in his evidence that not all of the recommendations from those reviews, the exercises, were in fact implemented, and he agreed in his evidence that not all of those recommendations were implemented, and accepts that these task and finish bodies took too long to ensure that the recommendations were implemented. And in the words of Lady Hallett, they were given the task, but they didn't finish. His evidence really began with a very helpful overview as to how the devolution structure looks in Wales in respect of health, and explains that the health services in Wales are almost entirely devolved, which of course means they're within the responsibility of the Welsh ministers and the Welsh civil service. But at the start of devolution, civil contingencies were not devolved, and ultimately it was through the Transfer of Functions Order of 2018 that the formal transfer of functions in dealing with civil contingencies came. We heard later on in the day from Mark Drakeford that there were requests for funding to ensure that those functions were properly resourced from Cabinet Office, but it seems as though those requests for funding weren't adequately met. One of the themes emerging certainly in Wales is the complexity of the various different bodies which exist in Wales. The Wales Resilience Forum, the Wales Resilience Partnership Team, the Civil Contingencies Group, the Wales Civil Contingencies Committee, the Resilience Steering Group, STAC, the Emergency Coordination Centre, and so on. And these, Andrew Goodall explained the role of these bodies, and it was put to him that there was a complexity and a plethora of different bodies. He acknowledged that there are many bodies, and recognised that, in fact, Wales needs to be very clear about what parts of those are working at the moment, and certainly needs help with clarity of these issues. He accepted that there were too many arrangements in place at the time, and may have changed Welsh Government focus and what was needed. He accepted that there are too many examples of duplication activities happening, even as Welsh Government adopted responsibilities in 2020. 2018. He also accepted that the Welsh Government hadn't passed regulations to discharge Part 1 responsibilities, part 1 of the contingencies. There was some evidence given about the risk register. There were 2 risk registers, the National Risk Register and the Corporate Risk Registers in the operation. Wales, as we've already touched upon, uses the National Risk Register, and it was put to Andrew Goodall that risks which present themselves to the United Kingdom and England are not necessarily the same risks that may present themselves to Wales, because you may have a particular form of threat or hazard in Wales. He noted that the Wales Resilience Forum has a programme of work which highlights those risks that may emerge, but he accepted that now a Wales-specific risk register is being introduced, and he did accept in his evidence that that will have more unique issues to Wales. It was put to him that this should have been done, a Wales-specific risk assessment, at the time of the transfer of functions in 2018. He didn't. He was pushed on it. He noted that the resilience team has been producing this risk register for Wales as one of the lessons learned from the pandemic. In terms of other matters, I mean, there was again some exploration of the learning exercises, Cygnus 2014, Cygnus 2016. Of course, arising from the recommendations from Cygnus 2016, there were 12 recommendations in the Welsh context, 22 overall. Andrew Goodall accepted that those 22 were also relevant to Wales, and noted that they would have continued to show some consistent concerns, that even if plans or activities were taking place, they still hadn't come to the best outcome that would give resilience in those arrangements. Examples given about draft communication strategies being in place, and a draft extreme surge guidance plan being in place, but at the point in time weren't in fact issued. So very comprehensive and very detailed evidence that was given by Andrew Goodall. Quite interestingly, his view, I think, when pushed, is that there was some complexity in the system, and then later on in the day, Mark Drakeford gave evidence and was able to very comprehensively explain that complex system with relative ease.
If you could keep working back to Andrew Goodall, it said, sort of asked him if these things we put in place now, if that were an egregious example of locking the stable horse door after the horse is bolted.
Well, yes, and again, I think he when pushed, he did accept it.
I wonder, I'm speaking now as a member of the Bereaved Families, but for me, it's like, because, and I don't know if you agree, Barbara, what we're looking for is change for the future. So yes, it is bolting the door after, but why not? Why not be better prepared for the future?
Most definitely. We've got to do that. We can't have what's happened thus far happen again, ever. And our future generations depend on us. And so you have to get it right now.
Yeah, I'd rather it bolted after the horse bolted than not at all.
Precise. So
I agree. It was a soundbite question.
Yeah.
He wanted that phrase to be published. I think it was completely irrelevant. We knew it had been done too late, but better done than not at all, as you say.
So who was up next?
So next we have Vaughan Gething, who was from May 2016 the Cabinet Secretary for Health, Wellbeing and Sport. And then in 2018 he became the Minister for Health and Social Services. There was, I think this witness is likely to be the most concerning from the perspective of the bereaved families, as a number of questions began with his awareness of the pandemic as being a priority for the minister. It was put to him that when he became the Deputy Minister for Health, whether he knew that pandemic influenza was a Tier 1 risk for the UK. He says quite candidly that no, it wasn't the focus of my role as a Deputy Minister for Health. He noted that when he became a Cabinet Minister in 2016, there was not an in-depth briefing, and it was on the run-up to Cygnus that he became much better informed about the preparation for a pandemic and the scale of it. He accepted that he didn't read the National Risk Register. He accepted that in respect to the strategy, the 2011 strategy, he'd received briefings on the strategy in advance of Cygnus and briefings on the Welsh strategies. He was asked if he'd read the Wales framework. He indicated that he was aware of it insofar as he was briefed on it. And in respect of that framework, he ultimately, when pushed, accepted that he didn't read it whilst he was in office. Similarly, he accepted in the same point in respect of the guidance. He knew that there was a Welsh Government risk register, but he indicated that he didn't read it. So some concerning issues there. I think perhaps most concerning is what we see following Cygnus of 2016, because Paul Gethin did in fact attend Cygnus in 2016. He indicated that he attended ministerial meetings over those 2 days, and his deputy attended as requested. There was a report which followed Cygnus, which indicated that the UK's preparedness and response in terms of its plans, policies and capability is currently not sufficient to cope with the extreme demands of a severe pandemic. He was asked if he remembered reading that, and he didn't. So some concerning answers. His response to this is, of course, that he's the minister. He deals with priorities. So his attentions are on those matters which are most concerning at that particular time. A number of questions were asked of him about the UK government and the Welsh government relations. It was quite interesting. He accepted that there were strained relations, and at times those relations with the UK government hampered preparedness.
He dropped Matt Hancock in it a little bit, didn't he? He said that he hampered the Wales pandemic prep by refusing to engage and ignoring emails.
That's right. He did indicate that, and he was indicating that he would request meetings and sometimes wouldn't receive responses. He did indicate that they were good relations with officials. He did note that when ministers agree, it speeds up decision making, and in his experience, if there is ministerial engagement, that would move preparedness along.
And should we finish up with Mark Drakeford?
Yes, so Mark,
First Minister of Wales.
Exactly. So the First Minister of Wales, he obviously became First Minister in December of 2018, and before that he was Minister for Health and Social Services and Cabinet Secretary for Finance. So very well qualified to deal with these sorts of issues. Mark Drakeford gave a very, very good summary at the start of his evidence about the extent to which the transfer of functions order in 2018 was problematic for Wales. He indicated that when the functions were transferred formally in 2018, firstly he indicated that for some time before that, in many ways, the transfer of functions order was simply regularising the way in which things were happening on the ground for some time. He indicated that in his very first year, he was part of advising the Welsh Government on flooding, for example, on fuel protests, foot and mouth disease, indicating that the Welsh Government has really always been involved in dealing with civil emergencies from the very start of devolution, but it just simply wasn't formalised, and it was formalised to the 2018 transfer of functions order. But he indicated that, as one might expect, the normal pattern would be that a transfer of functions is accompanied by a transfer of funding to discharge those functions, because those functions are already being discharged elsewhere. So you no longer need to discharge them at that central government level, and the funding can follow. But he indicated that despite requesting funding from the Cabinet Office, that request wasn't met. There were 8 posts created at the time in 2018 to deal with these new responsibilities, and they were funded from an existing Welsh Government resource. He maintained that the structures in place in Wales were adequate from the perspective of a minister. He indicated the system might the system actually for a minister doesn't seem actually that complex. You don't consider it as a sort of form of web. If it's working, then it's achieving the aim that it needs to achieve.
Thank you for listening to this instalment of the COVID Inquiry podcast. Elkan, Nicola and the team at Broudie Jackson Canter are looking forward to bringing you more expert commentary, opinion and insight next week.